I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair here in China Studies and Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy. And welcome to this event in commemoration of the 15th anniversary of China's entry into the World Trade Organization. At the 5th anniversary, 10 years ago, it was more of a pretty festive occasion. I think there was a lot of celebration all around. At the 10th anniversary, things were more anxious. I hosted a big event on the 10th anniversary in Beijing with a lot of attendance, but a lot of anxiety, and people were worried, obviously, because of the challenges with the Doha round by then and the global financial crisis. So there were definite worries. The 15th, I think, might be labeled the unhappy anniversary. Many in the West are worried that China is undermining the WTO, and China fears that the West is walking away from the WTO. Now, both are exaggerations, but we are at a difficult moment in history of the WTO and the liberal international order. And in many ways, that's really tragic because the WTO is such an excellent organization. It has a clear mission, an excellent staff. It's unbelievably transparent. Everything about its operations, activities are available. Access to staff, visiting, it's unbelievably visible and operates by consensus. In addition, it's amazing how small the staff is. I don't know if you are aware of this, but there's less than 1,000 employees at the WTO. And you think of the UN with the hundreds of thousands of employees and other international organizations. This is a lean, mean machine. It's quite impressive. Now, we have a terrific program today. I first want to thank our sponsors, UPS, AmCham China, and Alibaba. We're very grateful for their support. I also want to thank the Freeman Chair staff, led by Marina Leonhardt, who's done a terrific job preparing for today. And I want to thank all of our speakers who are here, who will explain this historical juncture to all of us. In addition to all of them, I want to say thank you to our terrific partners, the Asia Society's Policy Institute. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with Wendy Cutler in creating this event. You have her bio in the materials we passed out, which lists all of her accomplishments from negotiating Chorus to leading negotiations over TPP with Japan. She really is an American treasure and has contributed so much to our country. This is just an honor to have the chance to work with her on this program. So I'm going to turn things over to her for the first segment of this morning's program. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Wendy Cutler.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the and since Scott said, let me just say, I'm going to learn a lot from. It's really hard to say at the 15th anniversary. It's almost this deal, and it's a noteworthy. We are at no doubt that have benefited from China's WTO address market 15 years, new rules, negotiations, and the trade. China's been an active member and has not been, Scott alluded to, changed dramatically since then. And thank you.
Asian ecosystem. And the way it did that was by combining the large manpower reserves and low cost, and forms what you see even still today. So the results of these, and of course, you saw then an explosion of China's further internal reform and external reform through WTO accession, which took Deng Xiaoping's economic size, surpassed that of the United States in October of 2014. China is the world's largest capital, $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, which signifies, among other things, a massive shift in And of course, as you know, its universities now graduate over 6 million kids a year. But most well aware of the nature and extent of this environmental degradation. And last, China's growth model involved a tolerance for sharp income inequality. There's a tenfold disparity between the richest provinces and the poorest provinces. The poorest 25% of the population hold 1% of China's wealth. This creates internal instability. It creates strikes because of land confiscations, because of wage arrears, because of widespread lapses in healthcare and social safety net, particularly in rural areas for farmers and so on. And while the leadership absolutely very rightly has focused on the quality of growth, not just the quantity of growth, and while all of that should be positive for the environment and for internal stability, we have yet to see the final story written here. So the policy environment in China is extremely fluid and complicated, and it is no less fluid and complicated for U.S. and foreign businesses, not only because the economy is slowed, but because the environment in China has shifted negatively for foreign businesses. Multinationals saw enormous gains in China from what was called the golden age of reform and opening, from roughly 1999 to, say, 2007, 2008. But at that juncture, economic reform and opening began to sputter, and today it's moribund. It is virtually moribund. And in the place of economic reform and opening are a spate of increasingly what are seen as zero-sum mercantilist policies. These are counterproductive in their own right for China's economy and the shift in its economic model. They're damaging to U.S. and foreign commercial interests, and they have the potential to destabilize the U.S.-China relationship as a whole. So you know that China is consistently ranked far below its peers in terms of regulatory restrictiveness and ease of doing business. And China has fallen far short of the party's own rhetoric in the third plenum to let the market play a decisive role in the economy. But instead of that, we see a range of highly discriminatory policies, and I think most of you in the audience know the litany: resurgence of state-owned enterprises, restrictions on foreign investment, creation of national champion companies, massive subsidies, forced tech transfer, cyber espionage, weak intellectual property rights enforcement, indigenous innovation, so on and so forth, and particularly targeted is the ICT sector, the information and communications technology sector, which covers almost everything you can think of from soup to nuts in the new economy that we have today. That sector has been particularly targeted for indigenization, meaning roll up into domestic companies and discriminate against foreign companies to a substantial extent. So what does all this mean for the future? I'll leave you with 4 thoughts. First of all, discriminatory policies and the headwinds that they create, and indigenous innovation and the rest of the policies, explain businesses' very guarded outlook on China. There is more business pessimism today than 10 years ago with respect to doing business in China. But China will continue to calibrate its policies, at least at this juncture, to avoid driving out foreign companies from China. And that's because China remains dependent on foreign companies for a significant share of current growth. And avoiding economic distress and disruption is critical. The economy can't slow much further. As a practical matter as well, China needs foreign companies, most especially their cutting-edge technology, to fill the innovation gap in China between its aspirations and its capabilities. So while China, I think, would prefer to eliminate or sharply reduce dependency on foreign companies, it can't do that in a reckless and fast way. But I will say that the business opportunities in China will be harder to get, they will be more costly to get, and growth in the market will be increasingly geared toward domestic Chinese companies. Second of all, second observation, to maximize market access, foreign companies, I think, are increasingly going to have to demonstrate that their firm-level success contributes meaningfully to China's own national development goals. Some companies are trying to indigenize, transferring IP, transferring cutting-edge technology in China so that it can be considered more Chinese and therefore more apt to get additional market access opportunities. Other companies are resorting to practices that had long since been abandoned. Joint venture agreements on large projects, or partnership or other agreements with Chinese companies, almost as a condition of being able to get into, for example, a bidding situation, or direct support for government initiatives, all to preserve or increase market access. Third observation, China's indigenization drive is going to transform the global economy whether or not it succeeds, because it will be a disruptive effort, both within China and external to China. China's funds for, its subsidies for strategic industries are huge. The estimates in the aggregate and over time are that China will put in $500 billion into strategic emerging industries. It's very difficult to compete with $500 billion. So that commercial disruption that's already evident will intensify regardless whether full indigenization actually ever succeeds. And last, China has demonstrated an ability to transform itself at a speed and a scale without historic parallel. But today's transformation takes place in a very different global economic environment. China is bound by the WTO and by the rules that it establishes, which are designed to prohibit discrimination, create a level playing field, and strengthen global convergence around a series of norms with respect to commercial behavior. A rebalancing of China's growth model can be readily accomplished within that framework. But China's current policies run counter to the rights of its trading partners and is directionally at odds with Deng Xiaoping's integrative, market-based reform and opening. So the international response to China's policies hasn't yet fully coalesced, but at least in the US, here's what you hear. Increased calls for greater reciprocity on trade and investment, expanded investment review, enhanced enforcement, potential trade law legislation to, among other things, block imports that benefit from forced technology transfer or cyber theft. There are calls for downsizing and reconceiving the JCCT and SNED because there is a view that there's been a dearth of meaningful progress on trade, particularly over very recent years, and calls for declaring China an exchange rate manipulator. These latter calls ought to be reviewed very, very carefully, and I think Treasury Department is up to the task. Of equal importance to these particular initiatives, it is imperative that China reignite, pursuant to its own planning documents, economic reform and opening. The web of policies in China that are beginning to hamper and do hamper foreign business are very complex. And that suggests, with respect to helping reignite reform and opening, that the U.S., rather than not negotiate trade agreements, needs to negotiate agreements with China, but agreements of a systemic nature. That is to say, agreements with broad reach, much as the first wave and second wave of economic reform did. So whether that's through BIT negotiations or services negotiations in TISA in the WTO, or government procurement negotiations, but agreements with broad systemic reach become extremely important when job one is the reigniting of reform and opening of the Chinese economy. The TPP template remains the vehicle best suited to address the kinds of systemic practices we've been talking about. And for this, but for many other reasons, economic and particularly geostrategic, this agreement, the TPP, should be fixed, not jettisoned. If you don't like it, fix it, but don't throw it away. So China's first two waves of reform and opening fundamentally altered the Chinese economy to the benefit of the Chinese people, the globe, and obviously foreign participation. A third wave is now critically important. If China is going to ensure sustainable, inclusive growth domestically, and if market-based outcomes, per the plenum, if market-based outcomes for all participants across all sectors is to be achieved. In my view, that's the next job. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that great presentation. There's so many questions I can ask, but I'm going to be brief, ask one, and then really turn to the audience and give you all a chance to ask a few questions. Charlene, if you could take yourself back 15 years or so, and looking back at where you were when these negotiations were concluded, what has surprised you the most about where we find ourselves today? And what has surprised you the least? And did you sense, when you were involved in these negotiations, how significant they were and how impactful they would be, not only on bilateral relations, multilateral relations, but regional relations?
Going backward here, I knew that this was a very significant negotiation. I had always known it would enhance China's economy. I always felt that. I always felt it would help to further alter Asian relations in a positive way. When I first met Mickey Cantor, when he had just been named by Bill Clinton to be his USTR, so this is right after the inauguration, before he was formally nominated, Mickey Cantor called me and said, I'd really like to pick your brain. I've heard a lot about you. And I said to him, I'm not going into the administration, so if this is a call about going in, I'm not going in. Anyway,
that worked well.
That worked well. And so I met with him like a day or two later. He came in from LA, where he was living. And he said to me, what should I accomplish as USTR? And the first thing I said was, China needs to be in the GATT. It was called the GATT then, right? WTO didn't exist. I said, China needs to be in the GATT. I said, that's job one, and job two is Russia needs to be in the GATT. So that was in 1993. And it seemed pretty obvious that large countries, which had different economic systems, but who were very substantial players globally, geostrategically, ought to be brought into a system that is predicated on Western norms. As their economies would grow and change, we wanted them to grow and change in a direction favorable, compatible with those norms, not in a direction further askew. So what surprised me the most is the rapidity with which China's growth exploded. And I think that probably for most economists was the surprise. Not that it did explode or grow, but how fast the change occurred. And I have to tell you, I give a lot of credit to the Chinese leadership at the time because this was a big risk, a very big risk. I remember saying to Zhu Rongji, I don't know of any economy that was, as Ben Franklin used to say, ever made worse by trade. And I don't know of any country or economy that became destabilized economically because of GATT admission or WTO admission. It's really quite the reverse. But still, for China, it embarked on this extraordinary experiment. It could only be thought of as an experiment because there's no country of that size and magnitude. And so the rapidity of the growth surprised me. What didn't surprise me was that China ultimately made the leap, and that was because of only one person, and that was Zhu Rongji, then the premier, who had a vision and an economic understanding that impelled his and Jiang Zemin, the president of China at the time, his and Jiang Zemin's view that China should join the WTO.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more quick question, and then I'm going to turn it over. Was there a moment in the negotiations that you knew this was going to happen, that you were going to be successful? Was there a turning point?
Was there a turning point? Well, there were many turning points, some good, some not so good. I'd have to think about that a little bit, probably longer than we have time for. I think every negotiation, I mean, you know this better than anybody in the world, up and down and up and down, and then you begin hitting that sort of trajectory, and then inevitably something happens and it falls apart. And then you've got to pick up the pieces and you go on again. And so there was a lot of that, because this was such a long negotiation. There was a lot of that. But I do think China's determination to get it done became more and more evident over time. And that was the most important factor. That is political will. That's the most important factor in any negotiation.
Great. Okay. Who would like to raise a question for Ambassador Barshevsky? Are there microphones? Scott, okay. Second round. You can introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ms. Baskifili. I'm Qihang Zheng from Xinhua News Agency. I have two questions. First is that we know now this year is the 15th anniversary of China entering the WTO, and China said that according to the Article 15, China should automatically get the market economic status from its members, but it seems that the US, EU, and Japan refuse to do that. How do you think this difference? And my second question is that China has sued those members who still want to use the surrogate country system to launch trade proposals against China's products. So how do you think of this suit in WTO and its implications to the future trade, global trade? Thank you.
Sure. Well, it's pretty clear that the US, Japan, Europe take one view with respect to the continuation of China's non-market economy status, and China takes a different view. And what that says is that the protocol of accession, the ultimate language agreed to in, I guess, 2001, when China formally entered, is ambiguous. That is to say, that's the document on which each side has to rely. That's what a WTO panel will look at, China reads it one way, other countries read it another way, and I think this will be for a panel ultimately to sort out. Given that you have dispute settlement in the WTO, and that all of these countries, Europe, the US, China, Japan, they have brought cases, they've also been a defendant in cases at the WTO. I suspect the process will proceed as usual, and I think a panel will ultimately render a decision, and I think all the parties will comply, whatever that decision is.
Spoken like a true lawyer, diplomat, and negotiator. I've learned from the best. Another question. Sir?
Thank you. Jean-François Boitin with The Globalist. Actually, on this issue, there is something that needs to be said. The number 2 at the Central Bank of China 6 months ago said in a rival think tank that the Chinese economy is not a market economy. But my question is totally different. Don't you think, Ambassador Barshevsky, that by going after China now, people are fighting the last war, i.e. most of the delocalization that has hurt a number of communities in this country, that's not going to happen for the very reason that Chinese wages are too high now. So most of the businesses I've been talking to want to delocalize out of China to go to Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam, of course, hence the TPP.
Well, yes, China's wages are rising and so on. Look, I was always of the view that if you aren't going to enforce a trade agreement, don't do it, right? Because every country, the US included, takes liberties with the agreement it signs. And so I don't view it as the last war if a country like China or any country, whether it's Germany or the United States or Mexico or Brazil, if any country is violating what it agreed to, you enforce the agreement. It seems to me this is pretty self-evident. So I don't view that as the last war. I do think that the US and China have a great deal in common. And I do think each country has to be cautious with respect to the other. Each has to sit down with the other before making public pronouncements, and each needs to understand the other's viewpoints. That's not happening right now at this moment. My hope is that it will happen soon because miscalculation is too costly for both sides and for the world.
One more question. Yes.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Good to see you again, Ambassador Barshevsky. Still remember the days when you were at the USTR. President-elect Trump, is not shying away from probably being very tough on China, particularly in terms of trade. Do you think his approach, what do you think of his approach? Are you concerned about any possible US-China trade war? Thank you.
I would not, I wouldn't read too much into what is being said now. I think you have to wait for a new administration to actually come in, settle down, for each of the cabinet secretaries to learn their brief, and for the administration as a whole to coalesce around a series of positions, whether trade or defense or economic policy, so on and so forth. So I think talk of a potential trade war is not particularly constructive. But as I said before, it's equally true to say that each side needs to understand the other better than they do now. So that, in fact, talk of trade wars and things of that sort really are dispelled. I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a good note on which to end your part of the program. We can't thank you enough for joining us. Can we all now applaud for Ambassador Barshevsky? Thank you so much. Now we'll move to the panel.
Make sure this is working. All right, great. Essentially a seamless transition. We didn't turn the lights out, so I guess you could see all the motion. But we're terrific. Now, we really appreciate Ambassador Barshevsky's opening remarks to set the stage for the rest of the discussion. We've got a terrific panel, and we're going to do a 360 on China and the WTO to look at the different aspects of China's participation and the different roles that the WTO has. The WTO monitors the global economy and compliance, and it also manages disputes, which is one of the most important jobs that it has. It also negotiates trade agreements and further liberalization. And the WTO is a ballast for the liberal international order more generally. So we're going to do a 360, but in an hour plus, we can't go as deep as we'd like to. But what we hope to do is touch upon the most important aspects of China's participation in the WTO over its first 15 years of membership, and think a little bit about where the WTO is headed. So we have 5 terrific panelists to help us think through these issues. First, at the other end is you have all of their bios, so I'm not going to go in great detail, but I wanted just to point out just a couple things about each of them. Rufus Yerxa, who is now the president of the National Foreign Trade Council. He previously served as deputy U.S. Trade Representative and was the U.S. ambassador to the GATT. And he, from 2002 to 2013, served as Deputy Director General of the WTO, which coincided with China's first 12 years as a member. Yang Guohua is a professor at Tsinghua University. He was in the Ministry of Commerce and helped negotiate China's membership, working with Zhu Rongji, Long Yongtu, and all of the others across the table from Charlene. He was also Deputy Director General of the Legal Affairs Division at the WTO as well. To his left is Claire Reed, who is a senior counsel at Arnold and Porter. She served in USTR for many years, and from 2008 to 2014 was the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. And we're really glad that Claire is now a senior associate here at CSIS in the Freeman Chair as well. To her left, Matthew Yo is a partner with Steptoe and Johnson here in Washington, D.C. But Matthew has the good fortune of getting the chance to get on an airplane quite a bit and has litigated numerous cases before the WTO, including several involving China, including two cases that are known probably to most of you are the double remedies case, where countries have used countervailing duties and anti-dumping remedies simultaneously, as well as the electronic payment services case, also known as the Union Pay case. And then to my immediate left, Chad Bown, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He originally, in his first part of his career, was a professor at Brandeis University, then served in the National Economic Council, and also for many years worked at the World Bank. One of his biggest contributions to researchers like myself is the development of a trade remedies database, which compiles trade remedies cases from around the world, makes them accessible to all of us so that we can look at trends not just in one country, but across many countries and look at trends over time. He's done a lot of research as well on the WTO as an institution as well, not just on China, but comparatively. So I think we have a terrific group here to look at China and the WTO, its anniversary. I'm going to begin by asking each of them one question to get the ball rolling. I'll then come back around and do a follow-up generally for everybody. And then I'll turn the floor over to all of you, let you all ask your questions as well. So with that, I'll get started. I'm going to start with Rufus. As someone who engaged China before it joined the WTO and then served at the WTO for over a decade, the same first decade as China's membership, what stood out to you as the biggest before and after picture and difference in China's participation in the global economy? And to what extent do you see China having an influence on the evolution of the WTO?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Scott. I want to thank CSIS and the Asia Society for inviting me. Great to be with two of my absolute favorite former USTR colleagues, Wendy Cutler and, of course, Ambassador Barshevsky. I'd like to go back, Charlene alluded to this, but I'd like to go back to kind of my first involvement. I actually arrived in Geneva as the U.S. representative to the GATT shortly after the Tiananmen Square protest had begun. There was a working party on China's GATT accession already underway at the time. And people will remember this. It was really a very dark time. That working party was suspended. And of course, with all of the turmoil and discord that incident had created, it took really until 1992 to get the negotiations going again. I was involved in the 1992 understanding, which ultimately set the template for the later accession of both China and Taiwan, which didn't occur for almost a decade after that. So obviously this was a long history that took a lot of patience and a lot of changes in, unexpected changes in the landscape of the world in order to accomplish. And then we think about the Uruguay round, which China obviously wasn't part of, but which China then benefited from because of the liberalization that ensued from that. the growth of trade. You know, at the time it was negotiating its accession in '92, China wasn't really a major player in any real category of world trade except textiles and apparel, and that, let's remember, largely because of access to the US and European markets that it had acquired. And then during the accession process, and here I really need to pay tribute not only to Charlene, but to some incredible leaders in China who were involved in that negotiation, like Long Yong-tu. China really used that accession to make major reforms domestically, to fundamentally change its economic approach, and a huge burst of optimism about China's participation in the world economy as a more open market at the time of its accession. So the first few years, of course, we had the transition mechanism during China's accession, but the first few years were, I think, capturing that reality that China had become a significant player and was going to be a major contributor to the growth of the system. I would say, though, regrettably, the latter years of its membership, the last several years, I would say have been more disappointing, certainly in the respect that the major role that China should have had and the major role of US-China cooperation in leadership of the system. If you have to measure that by the failure of the Doha round, that certainly isn't an indication that that leadership model has worked. Previously in the GATT system, the leadership model was very much the United States and the Europeans. In the Uruguay round, we had the Quad mechanism. There was a lot of hope that this was going to change fundamentally with the growth of the newly emerging economies as participants in the system. But if the first example of that is the failure of the Doha round, it's not a very good sign, let's put it that way. So where are we now? And that's just my last point. I think Charlene Barshevsky really captured it very well. A lot of concern about the fact that reform has stalled in China. A lot of business pessimism about China not moving forward with further liberalization. And China needs to do something to reignite that reform and create greater opening. And now we see new tensions emerging, obviously things beyond the scope of trade negotiators to deal with, the South China Sea, surprisingly now issues about one China policy. I won't go into that. That's a realm trade negotiators are wise not to touch. But I think that my biggest concern now is whether, given the magnitude of China's economy, its power in the international system, how is it prepared to use it to put multilateralism back into the realm of the possible, shall we say, in future years.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Rufus. Very helpful, broad context. Let me turn to Yang Guohua now and ask a similar question, but from someone who's on the inside working in China, growing up there, working for the government, and as a law professor. And wanted to ask you about the mutual effect that China and the WTO have had on each other. How much has WTO membership changed China, its regulations, the behavior of Chinese companies, China's involvement in the global economy and governance? And what do you think are some of the contributions that China has made to the WTO? I know Rufus pointed out the challenges with the Doha round, but that's not the only job that the WTO faces in terms of negotiating. And as the WTO has evolved in terms of its membership, there are ways in which perhaps China has shown leadership which maybe people aren't as familiar with.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your kind invitation. It's a great honor and privilege to be here for this very important event. As far as I know, this is the only overseas event on the 15th anniversary of China's WTO accession. Although we do have in the past year, we have 7, 8 events in China commemorating the WTO accession. There are a lot of media reports right now in the past week on China's accession of 15 years, and I realize that most of the reports are positive. Although there are lessons to be learned, but most of the media reports are positive about China's accession. And also, I was also very happy to read one of the most important speeches by Trade Minister Gao Hucheng yesterday on the People's Daily, one of the most important newspapers in China, on the supporting of the China WTO accession, supporting the multilateral trade system, and also talk about at the same time about Article 15 issue, market economy issue at the same time. And also today I also saw a report on a very recent case against the United States and the EU on the Article 15 issue, that is market economy issue once again. So these are generally the events happening in China around the anniversary. But today, my brief reflection or sharing with you is a more or less a story of a rule of law, according to my experience when I was working in the Ministry of Commerce in the past 15 years. So on the story of rule of law is as follows. The first one was that when China negotiated reached agreement with the United States, the delegation headed by the Ambassador Charlene here, that was 1999, end of 1999. Ministry of Commerce, together with many other agencies in the Chinese central government, established working groups on checking and amending trade laws, economic laws, to ensure that they are in compliance with the WTO rules and Chinese commitments. So that process lasted for 2 years. That is from the end of 1999 to the early of 2002. So I was fortunate to be in the working group as the headquarters or the coordinating center for the all China checking and amending process. So we made a lot of amendments like right to import and export in one of the articles in the former China foreign trade law, and also we also amended some balance issue, export requirement for the foreign trade law, foreign investment law. So we checked thousands of regulations and laws in China at that time. So according to one of the statistics, that is 2,300 laws and regulations were checked, and hundreds were amended. Of course, at the same time, we also made some new laws and regulations for market opening, especially for the trading services. So this is the phase one of the rule of law experiment or experience I had when I was in the Ministry of Commerce. The second phase of the rule of law process, according to my experience, was WTO litigation. The cases, I was also fortunate to be one of the first litigation team in the Ministry of Foreign Trade, and so we have right now 50. According to today's statistics, we have 52 cases. That is 52 cases in WTO in the past 15 years. This is a huge number. So this is a part of a very big rule of law process, according to my understanding, on the trade area, which means that we are trying to use a kind of a legal means, right? Legal mechanism to settle disputes between China and the US, China and the EU, etc. So this is not a kind of a unilateral retaliation approach which we had before China's accession, as we had in the early 90s on the U.S.-China intellectual property negotiations. Both sides threatened to retaliate rather than using the WTO system. Of course, at that time, we did not have a WTO yet. So this is the second phase, I think, which is very important. Even for today's two cases, that is the case against EU and EU, I think EU and the US, I think this is also one of the most recent progress that China tried to use legal means, legal mechanism, WTO dispute settlement system to settle a dispute between US and China, US and China, EU and China. This is one of the positive rule of law approach, according to my understanding. The third and almost the last process of rule of law observation was the so-called compliance check. This is the name I gave to the process. Compliance check work in the central government, happening in China. So, you know, in the year 2014, that is only 2 years ago, the State Council of China issued a notice on the compliance work, compliance with the WTO rules on all the economic policies. So this is one of the notice from the central government on all the policy making in China. So I myself was also fortunate to participate in the education campaign organized by the Ministry of Commerce. So this is kind of an all-country campaign to educate all the people. Yes, thank you. And also, I also fortunate to participate in one of the ministries' work in the compliance work to check their laws and regulations. So these are the three processes, three phases: checking according to checking laws, filing cases, and also the compliance work are the stories, according to my experience, on the rule of law. And last word on the, I think these are the impacts on the rule of law development in China. On the last part of your question from Scott, on China's accession or impact to the WTO, I think respect the rules and settling disputes according to WTO rules are in itself a kind of contribution from China to the world trading system. Just imagine, China would not amend any laws. China would not abide by the rules. China would rather to choose kind of unilateral action against the US and the EU this time on the Article 50 issue without filing the case in the WTO. What will happen? I think this is the part of that contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guohua. That's super helpful. I mean, I guess it speaks to China's role as being an important citizen of the global international economy, which required a lot of domestic changes, but also how it participates internationally. Let me turn to Claire now. From the perspective of someone who has engaged China from across the table, both in disputes and negotiating further market liberalization, what are the biggest takeaways that you have from this experience in dealing with China? And has the WTO been an effective mechanism to liberalize China's economy and for it to play a more constructive role? Do you see there's been a discussion so far about, sort of early WTO versus more recent. What does the evolutionary trend look like to you?
Well, thank you, Scott, and thanks to the Asia Society Policy Institute as well as CSIS for doing this program today. I think it's a very important one. Let me pick up on what Yang was just saying. I think, and let me look at this from two angles. One is the dispute settlement angle and the issue of existing rules in the WTO. And then I'll turn and take a look at negotiations of new rules and how that seems to be going. So there's been a lot of going over the ground of the important accomplishments that China made by taking on the rules of the WTO. As Charlene said, the risks that China took. And I think we've seen the rewards to China and the world system from taking that risk. And so now let's look at what's happened in dispute settlement. As Yang was just saying, China is not a scofflaw. China is not ignoring all the rulings, and China is therefore not triggering retaliation across the board from the other trading partners. So in that very, very important sense, the system is working, and that is critical to the utility of the WTO. So without that, we would really be in trouble in terms of one of the key parts of the WTO system. I think China understands that actions speak very loudly. I think China feels a sense of responsibility that it wants to project itself as a central player in the global system, and you can't do that if you act like a gangster. So I think that's important. Now, I think that means in general that China has respected the WTO process in dispute settlement and has followed through when it's lost. There are some troubling exceptions to that, and I'll just give you one example. The financial information case, this is the one with the credit cards and the issue of access to China's services market for the back-end processing of these kinds of transactions. Unfortunately, the WTO found that China needed to open this market to US service suppliers, and it has not really happened. This leads, it's been years now, and while some legal changes have come very slowly, it is concerning. And one of the things that a US observer takes from that is you wonder whether the fact that there is a major state-owned entity, China UnionPay, which is so powerful at home in China, is that creating difficulties for even China's leaders to actually follow through completely on that particular WTO case. It certainly looks like there are troubles in that area. But there are many cases where China did follow through. One important example for the world system is the export restraints on China's raw materials. China has dominant market share in certain raw materials, was restricting the export, was found to be in violation of WTO rules, and followed through to fix that, removing the export restrictions as the WTO ruling came out. That does lead to another point here, though. China did not take a larger view and look at the broad scope of all of its policies in this area and try to correct them proactively. So it's taken multiple WTO cases on specific raw materials to have China move with regard to changing its policies. That indicates, that it's more of a transactional view of these disputes. And one thing for China to think about is whether it's possible to take a more systemic view as China is looking to be a leader in these areas. Let me look quickly outside of the WTO dispute settlement now towards new negotiations on new rules. There it does seem that China is increasingly finding it complex to move forward in these negotiations. It seems as if more stakeholders are coming to the fore and that they are creating great complexities for China in terms of getting efficiently and effectively to negotiate what is probably the deal that's in China's long-term interests. It seems that some ministries and other entities are tied to particular industries or large players, and so there are really constraints on the system. So even if China's top leadership understands the long game and understands the economic benefits, this creates very serious issues. I think the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement is an example of that. It took a very long time. It actually took intervention by both Obama and President Xi to bring that across the finish line, and obviously China's leaders don't have the time to be involved in every economic decision. Premier Li talked about how China's reforms, are going to require the warrior to actually cut off its hand to save its body. I actually think we need both hands if we're going to actually be effective, so I'm hoping no hands are cut off. And President Xi talked about the fact that it was entering the deep waters for reform where there are significant difficulties. I think that's what we may be seeing.
Terrific. Thanks a lot, Claire. That's super helpful insight. Let me turn to Matthew now. Since Matthew's worked a lot on DSU cases, including several involving China, and if we just look at the dispute settlement side of things, which for me is a positive side of the system because as Guohua was saying, China's not engaging in unilateral actions, and it's just participating like others. How would you see China's learning curve as it's participated in the DSU, both as a respondent and as a complainant as well? Claire mentioned sort of the transactional versus systemic approach to things. To what extent is China similar or different in the way it participates in the DSU than others?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Scott and Wendy, for inviting me. We had the privilege to advise China in its first defensive case, the auto parts dispute. And then we advised China in its first offensive case, DS 379. So we were there kind of in the early days of their active involvement in the dispute settlement process. I would say what has always struck me the most about our experiences working with China on dispute settlement matters is the kind of systematic and methodical approach that they have taken from the beginning toward understanding the dispute settlement system, toward developing their capacity to be effective participants in the dispute settlement system. We noticed that really from the very first days of working with China. They had been very methodical even up to that time, being active third parties in disputes so that they could get access to submissions, go to panel and appellate body hearings, see how the process worked. They had used that in a very effective way to train people within MOFCOM and elsewhere about how the dispute settlement system works. They were also very thoughtful about building out their capacity in the private sector, in private law firms, in academia. There's really no other country like China, in terms of the number of people who study and understand and follow WTO law. There's nothing else quite like it. Here, it's a very obscure niche area of legal practice. There are really a great many people who are familiar with WTO legal concepts. And perhaps the best illustration of that, if you go to, and I forget what its name is in English, but the National History Museum that's right on Tiananmen Square there, you go through and you come to a point where there's an exhibit, a large glass box that has the signed protocol of China's accession to the WTO as a major historical event in China's history. And so it's there for public viewing, and that's the level of significance that they attach to it. I think what's also been interesting is how, and I think Claire alluded to this, how China has used the dispute settlement process as a way of letting other ministries and parts of government know what China's WTO obligations are, and to do that in a very, I think, a very creative and useful way. And let me tell sort of a little anecdote in that regard. China's first major defensive case was the auto parts dispute, in which we represented them at the panel and before the appellate body. And there was a very large delegation at the appellate body hearing, a very large Chinese delegation at the appellate body hearing, many different ministries represented, all of which had some involvement in the auto parts issues that were in that dispute. And I remember speaking with members of the delegation afterwards, and I think they were very struck by what a fair hearing China got, and what a careful process, a careful legal process it was. In particular, I think they were struck by the fact that Jennifer Hillman, who was then on the appellate body and in that division, a U.S. national, but she's on the appellate body, and gave all sides a very thorough grilling, including the United States. And I think that was kind of a testament to the rule of law and to the independence and integrity of the dispute settlement system. And I think that was very meaningful. And I think the result was meaningful. The appellate body corrected some overreach by the panel, and the result was a fair one. And so I think that was an important first step in the process. Let me come finally to your last point, and something that Claire mentioned as well, the so-called electronic payment services case. I've known Claire for a long time, and here, respectfully, I have to disagree with you. In that case, China, the panel made limited findings with respect to certain measures, and China withdrew every single one of those measures. And at the WTO, you don't get greater compliance than repealing all of the measures. So the United States, on issues like zeroing, public body, benchmark distortion, has consistently forced relitigation of those issues again and again at the WTO. And so I think this notion of taking kind of a broad view of compliance obligations is a two-way street. I'm not opposed to it, but I think the US has to look at it from its perspective as well, if it expects other members to take broad views of what their compliance obligations are.
Perfect. Thank you. Fantastic. That's extremely helpful, Matthew. Let me turn last to Chad and ask for an additional comparative perspective. As someone who's been a student of the WTO, as someone who's observed the arc of many new WTO members, particularly from the developing world, what's most distinctive to you about China's participation? Does it participate in a way that's similar to other new members? Or does it look much more like a veteran as part of the inner circle? Or is it distinctive from everybody? Does it stand out apart from the rest of the crowd?
So like everybody else, let me say thanks to CSIS and Asia Society for the opportunity to be here. So to answer your question, as I was thinking about this, I think my initial response was China is unique, but that wasn't all that helpful. And so then I started to think about it, well, as an economist, how do I think about it? And I started to think, well, you know what? China's not actually all that unique. China faces a lot of pretty much the same domestic political economic problems as all other WTO members do, and we need to take that into consideration as they've gone through this adjustment. I think the main difference about China compared to other developing countries, new accessions, is primarily just because of its size. And because it is so large and has the ability to have market power, and when it makes policy decisions that has implications for other countries around the world, then trading partners care. And trading partners care about what happens in China more than they might in a lot of other countries, not because China's being singled out, but it's just because China is so large and can move markets, essentially. So let me give you maybe 3 specific examples to highlight that, as I think some issues that have come up and that are relevant and resonant for today. I think the first is, we've already heard discussion of it from the audience, the non-market economy status issue. So the way I think about this is the rest of the WTO system has had to accommodate China, has had to adjust to the fact that China has entered into their world over the last 15 years. And that has meant a significant amount of dislocation in high-income countries, the United States, Europe. Now, that's normal, right? And this is part of the process of globalization. So then the question is, well, how do you choose to address it? And when China came into the WTO, there were a number of policy tools that the existing membership gave to themselves to potentially deal with this. One was a transitional safeguard, which was relatively infrequently used, a transitional safeguard and a separate one on textiles and apparel that was relatively used. The main mechanism that was used was non-market economy status and anti-dumping, okay? And that's what we're confronted with right today, and is the headline. But let's step back and put that into perspective. What does this actually mean, and what has actually happened with non-market economy status and anti-dumping? So I have a plug. I'll have a report coming out later this evening that puts numbers on this, but it's not that big of a deal in some sense, right? The way I estimate it, it's about 7%, we're thinking about it bilaterally from the United States-China perspective, it's about 7% of China's exports to the United States now are affected by anti-dumping. So about $35 or so billion a year in annual exports. And that's about the same in percentage terms when you look at it from the perspective of the whole G20, not just the United States. This is not just a US-China issue, this is a China with the world issue, Europe, India, et cetera. But what that also means is 93% of China's exports to the United States are completely unencumbered by anti-dumping, non-market economy status, right? And so this was sort of the bargain. This was the price that was paid in order to get that other $465 billion of annual exports without having to worry about that, right? So, and is this experience unique? Well, no. If we look at how other countries entered into the international trading system, and I think back to Japan in the 1950s. When Japan came in, the mechanism at the time was the existing GATT membership. They used Article 35. I'm not a lawyer, but I pretend to play one. And 50 countries or so triggered this thing, which meant they didn't even have to give MFN tariffs to Japan when they entered in. And many of them kept those exceptions in place until the early 1970s, right? And then after that, it was a negotiated sequence of voluntary export restraints and then anti-dumping that lasted on. So from comparison perspective, right, this little non-market economy status issue, let's take a step back and take a deep breath. It's, in relative terms, it's going to be okay, okay? Other issues, subsidies, export restraints, we've already heard a little bit about today. There are special concerns with China because the nature of its subsidies seems to be changing over time. They're not necessarily direct subsidies, but they're more of the indirect kind, state-owned enterprises feeding through to input industries, hot-rolled steel, commercial banking, rubber, that then feed into downstream manufacturing, right? That's different from the types of direct subsidies that we've seen in other countries as well. But the main reason why we care about those is just because China is so large, those subsidies can actually have an impact in other economies as well, right? So we have to grapple with those. The export restraints, right? Why do we care about China's export restraints on raw materials, rare earths? Well, it's because China is such a large producer of these minerals that are critical inputs necessary in manufacturing, and especially advanced manufacturing. And when there are these restraints in place, that adversely impacts foreign producers relative to domestic producers. The last thing that I wanted to end on, though, is what I think we're observing China go through right now, and this is a point to sort of reiterate what Ambassador Barshevsky said. China is now going through the transition that a lot of the West, the United States and Europe, grappled with when China entered into the WTO. China went from having a third of the world's capacity in steel production 10 years ago to now having 50% of the world's steel capacity, right? And it's overcapacity, it's too much. But what that means is now there's a couple of million people in China in steel production, coal, aluminum, that need to move out of those sectors, right? We struggled with this in the United States and in Europe, and as you've seen some of the globalization, anti-globalization backlash sentiment that's come up in the most recent election here in the US, the Brexit vote in Europe, the Wallonia step in the Canada-EU deal, is reflective of the fact that we didn't handle that all that well in the West, right? The adjustment to globalization. China is now going through some of that itself as it shifts out of some of these older industries and rebalances its own economy toward more domestic consumption and services. So we need to be patient with China as it grapples with these problems of its own, and hopefully China will learn from our own mistakes in not dealing with those sorts of issues all that effectively.
Thanks, Chet. That's super helpful. Let me go back now and ask a question to everybody. Feel free, any of you, to jump in. And then we'll turn things over to the audience. I just have two questions. I guess the first one, and I think it gets to this challenge, the challenge of China at the WTO, because there's so many different ways to look at it. One could point to level of government intervention in China as being particularly distinctive, or its size, as Chad points to. And when Ambassador Barshevsky negotiated the agreement with Yang Guohua and his team on the other side and others, it was thousands of pages long. I mean, you couldn't imagine how big this thing was to deal with. Is there anything, if we need to, is there any tinkering? We're talking, people are talking about, we wish hadn't let China in the WTO, or we've got to start over and just go to bilaterals and stuff. I mean, that seems, we can't go back and unwind history. But are there modest adjustments that we might think of making in the arrangement that China has with the WTO, both to help China adjust and help the rest of the WTO membership adjust as well, and help the WTO Secretariat manage that transition, because the Secretariat is only as effective as the ability of its members to deal harmoniously with each other, both in terms of competition and cooperation. So, all right, that's a mouthful of a question that probably has a lot. We would never allow anyone in the audience to ask such a hard-headed, crazy, long-winded question. But who would like to try and take it on first? Rufus?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I think the first thing to point out, it's very difficult to change anything fundamental about China's terms of participation without a major negotiation. And it doesn't take a genius looking at the current environment to see what the problem is. As you pointed out earlier, many people in China see them as having benefited tremendously from joining. Not surprisingly, when your exports go from 260 billion to 2.5 trillion in 15 years, and that China's been a big winner from globalization, and the WTO is part of that equation. The problem is that in a lot of the developed economies now, who have been the major leaders in the system, and I mentioned this earlier, that prior rounds of negotiation were only successful because of US and European leadership in bringing down their own barriers as well as leading an exercise of others. The exact opposite is the case. Most people now see us as having been more victimized by the recent period of globalization than beneficiaries. I won't argue to what extent that's true or not. I'm talking about broad political perceptions that we can see played out in this last election. And if you think about recent interaction in the WTO, just take, for example, the market access negotiations in the Doha round. They were characterized by China essentially aligning itself with developed countries who argued that there should be less than full reciprocity in reduction commitments in industrial tariffs on the part of developing countries, and China aligned itself with developing countries in that regard. So you had the bizarre paradigm that I never thought would work of the countries that had liberalized the most, the industrialized world, with low tariffs averaging now 2%, being expected to make greater proportionate reductions than countries which had much, much higher barriers. And this is one reason those negotiations failed, but to me it's symptomatic of a much broader problem. I think if China really sees itself as a huge beneficiary of this system, it has to recognize that there's a lot further to go in the WTO system, just in basic liberalization in areas such as tariffs, but also Charlene raised concerns, I think very significant concerns. If I talk to my companies about what are their concerns, I talked to one business executive whose company has major investments in China. He sort of said it's a little bit like being in a bad marriage because you can't possibly think of you don't know how you can tolerate it, but you can't think of leaving it either. And I think that's because of policies like indigenous innovation, state-owned enterprises in competition with companies that have to operate on different terms. And so I'm quite pessimistic right now that you can use the WTO as a platform to change that unless China is prepared to take a leadership role and fundamentally drive reform as part of its WTO strategy and be prepared to liberalize aggressively. Otherwise, I think what we're left with is probably, I think the next era is an era really of what we've already seen, competing regional arrangements and geostrategic competition between China and the US and the West, frankly, in how that comes out and how we deal with some of the current tensions. I don't mean to be too pessimistic, but I don't really see the WTO right now as a vehicle to do much unless there is a fundamental change in attitude.
Thank you very much. I realize that there are some criticisms, there are some concerns, there are also some expectations for China in the future of the WTO development. But one of the perspectives I wanted to share with you was the following. The first is that just imagine a China without a WTO membership. This is number one, question number one. Question number two is China in the WTO without respecting the rules or without resolving to the WTO dispute settlement system to solve the trade issues with other members. Question number three would be just to imagine that a WTO without China. So I think these are the ways to look at China in the past 15 years, both as WTO's impact on China or a China on the WTO. These are some of the questions I just wanted to share with you.
Terrific, terrific. Let me ask another question and then go to the audience they've been very patient. Two of the things that we've talked about that the WTO does is negotiate reductions in tariffs and trade barriers, pursuing liberalization. The other is handling disputes themselves. And we've got not inactivity, but not a lot of success on the first, and a lot of activity on the other side. As Claire mentioned, there's two hands. We don't want to chop off either of these hands, right? But we've got one that's not as active and the other that's lifting a lot of weights, all right? But in historical perspective, the WTO is the number of cases that come before it, I guess it depends how you count, is not super high. In the first 5 years, it handled over 200 plus cases. In the last 6 years, it's handled only 80-some cases, maybe 84 now, with the 2 that China asked this morning for. So could we, would one way going forward is, just let the WTO do its job in managing disputes. It's not a common law system, but let the legal mechanisms of dealing with disputes help settle this and help with the adjustment that Chad mentioned. I'm not trying to put in a plug for lawyers and getting lots of cases and calling out Matthew and Claire.
Like. I mean, yeah.
But if you want to, we can hand out cards at the end. But I'm just wondering, can the WTO, would it continue having a vibrant dispute settlement system and less on the former, or do we need better balance between the two?
I guess as the litigator, I'll take that first. I think there is, I've heard this expressed especially within the United States, and I think it's an understandable concern. I think there is a concern that as the negotiation side is less effective, more stress is put on the dispute settlement side, and parties begin to use the dispute settlement system to try to accomplish things that they wanted to accomplish through negotiation but were unable to. I think there is some of that going on. In general, though, I think that is overstated. I think it's easy to forget that the GATT first and then the WTO just made tremendous advances in trade liberalization. The baseline that we already have of trade liberalization and a rules-based trading system is itself significant in its own right, and it's worth preserving just as it is. Even if we accomplish nothing further, we need to preserve the system as it exists and to continue to have dispute settlement with regard to the accomplishments that have been made. And so I think it's important that while it's certainly frustrating that the negotiation side, the multilateral negotiation side, has not progressed, I don't think that is a good reason to walk away from the dispute settlement system. Perhaps my perspective on that would have been obvious, but I guess I will put in the plug for the dispute settlement system because I do think it's tremendously important.
Can I?
I'll go to Claire and then Chad, sure.
Okay, just to add a couple points with regard to that. First, historically, after World War II, when the GATT came in, the dispute settlement system under the GATT was extremely weak, with no mandatory disputes, really, so that the number of cases that really could be settled through this neutral channel was relatively small. Now, 1994, with the WTO coming into effect, really changed that situation and improved the opportunities for, as Professor Yang was saying, you know, the rule of law to sort of maintain itself and move forward. I do think, though, that it's been more than 20 years. And I think that it is, the vitality of the WTO is going to depend on both hands. So I totally agree that it should continue to use the dispute settlement system to try to resolve the problems that exist and can be resolved under the existing rules. The problem is that trade is is evolving. It's a very dynamic process. And so the kinds of concerns that countries have are evolving. So the question is really going to be, what are we going to do to deal with things like the effects of state-owned enterprises, the effects of really large-scale subsidies that are going to have distortive impacts on trade? What are we going to do about the digital environment? And what are we going to do about the importance of regulatory transparency and of regulation that works for the goals that are good goals inside the economy, as opposed to, say, being distorted for industrial policy goals? So that's my two hands argument.
Yes, sure. Chad?
So I would say two things. I said, first I would start by echoing Ambassador Barshevsky's point on TPP, which is, you know, now that actually we have an agreement there, China wasn't a part of the negotiations of the agreement, but China can see what the ask is, right? And I don't know what the forum is, and if they could be brought into the WTO. But as Claire just mentioned, the key elements for the United States are SOE disciplines, e-commerce and digital trade, and regulatory stuff, right? And so it's clear what the U.S. is interested in. Let's negotiate. Now, on the dispute settlement side, I look at it in the following way. And so this is a little bit informed by my experience in the White House, which was not at the height of the financial crisis, but sort of at the tail end, which even then there was heightened calls for enforcement, right? And I think we should also remember that crisis was just unbelievably deep and was a threat to the system. We could have gone back to the 1930s, and we didn't. And that really is a testament to the WTO, right? And so the idea that we could somehow today self-inflict wounds on the system that we managed to live through in 2008, 9, 10, I find shocking. But the enforcement point is, I look at it as one of two ways. You either respond to enforcement calls by shutting off imports coming in from China if you're the United States, or you proceed actively on the export side and you convince your public, nope, we're trying to improve our export environment to China. There are these issues that they have implemented and we have to stick resources into them. We have to identify what they are. We have to proceed with a legal case. But that's the effort that we're going to take. And so I think if you view dispute settlement as a positive response to calls to enforcement, I think that, I'm all for it as well. More for the litigators and dispute settlement.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank all of you answering my long-winded questions. We're going to go to people that ask better questions now, the audience. So there's mics. So raise your hands. I'll call on you. Someone will bring the mic and just identify yourself, your organization, and keep your questions relatively brief. We'll start right here in the third row from the front.
Thank you. Steve Schleich here. I was China Desk Director in the State Department at the time that China acceded to the WTO, and I remember one of the arguments that we made in favor of getting the Congress to pass permanent normal trade relations status for China was that our trade relations would not take place under WTO disciplines unless we granted PNTR, which the Congress did. And then we also argued that, in favor of that move, China would be bound by WTO disciplines and would be subject to dispute settlement process. And therefore, we would be able to take our disputes, should there be any enforcement troubles down the way. This is the way it was 15, 16 years ago. Well, I think I heard Ambassador Barshevsky say that today, that China, that its transformation under current situations, under current policies, without reform, will inevitably lead to some conflicts with developed country trading partners. I heard Ambassador Yerxa say that there's not much that can be done in dispute settlement in Geneva without actually changing the terms, the norms that underpin.
Negotiations, no.
That you need to have negotiations on a Doha round or on other issues that would get at the issues that Claire Reid raised, I think. So my question for any of you is, if you agree with what Ambassador Barshevsky said or implied, what specific kinds of cases, without revealing proprietary info, what sorts of cases do you think could be brought to the WTO dispute settlement to try to deal with the conflicts that you see coming down the pike because of the rebalancing of the Chinese economy in the absence of reform?
Thanks. Most likely cases. And it might not just be cases brought against China. It might be cases that China feels like it might want to bring itself. What do you think should rise to the top of the inbox? Is this, Chad mentioned subsidies. Are there other areas where that would get to maybe some of the systemic challenges that some feel?
I mean, just listening to companies that have concerns with China, and none of us has a crystal ball as to what kinds of cases are going to come up in the future, but, a lot of it does go to many of the policies you already see being put in place. There's a case now that they brought on these demonstration platforms, indigenous innovation policy, various regulatory barriers that raise national treatment issues. So I would say a lot of the cases will be cases related to subsidy policy. I think there will always be a nice dose of intellectual property or other kinds of concerns about policies in that area, and obviously regulatory policies and subsidies. My bigger concern, and listen, obviously I agree with everything everyone said about the importance of preserving the system as it exists today, the importance of the dispute settlement system. Obviously I worked for that for most of my career in helping to build the system and also in working in it. I think it has proven to be an important backstop, but I don't think we can go forward in the future without some fundamental changes in approach. That's my basic concern. And I think those fundamental changes in approach have to take on board, the need, the interest that China should have. As Charlene, I think, used the term reigniting reform. Clearly, that hasn't happened recently for reasons probably more related to domestic policy than to their global arrangements. It's not that certain things can't be done in the WTO. I mean, we did get an ITA too, but you see recently even something small like an environmental goods agreement didn't succeed, and largely because of resistance in China. So I'm not really optimistic without that fundamental change in perspective. And how we get that, I'm not suggesting that, that we're on a path to get that right now, given the dialogue between China and the U.S. more recently. I think we're going to have to work on that.
I'm not going to hazard a guess about cases that the United States might file against China, but I will make this observation. I looked at the statistics yesterday, and the United States has filed 19 cases against China, 10 of which have gone to a panel and either been resolved at the panel stage or proceeded to the appellate body. 8 of those have either resulted in a formal settlement, an MOU, MAS between the United States and China, or never went forward. The case simply withered on the vine. And 1 is currently approaching panel establishment. The United States has brought 2 compliance challenges. So in 2 cases, it has considered that China did not comply with the findings of the WTO. And both of those relate to Chinese trade remedy determinations. And so what I think this tells us, and I think Claire's remarks alluded to this as well, that there is still room for constructive engagement to use the dispute settlement process to resolve issues of concern to both parties in both directions. And that sometimes it will proceed to a panel in the appellate body, and sometimes it will lead to an agreement by which the measures are withdrawn. And so I hope that that process continues. And I think the evidence shows that China has been a constructive partner in that process. And hopefully that constructive relationship will remain in place over the next 4 years. We'll see.
Next question. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Jean with Baker Hosteller. I have a question about China's WTO market economy status. So I'm wondering, what's your interpretation about this article? And if China does not obtain market economy status, can China use the dispute resolution system to obtain the status? Thank you.
I think we have an answer to the second part in terms of their using the dispute settlement process, because the WTO case was filed this morning by China, as I understand it, against the EU and the United States. So I think that is underway. I think Charlene stated it very well this morning when she said that the text of the accession protocol is the language that will be the focus of the WTO dispute, and it's obvious that there are different interpretations of that language. And if you go and read the language, and you read it really carefully, you will see why there is now a WTO dispute, and that the language is quite complex. So I think we will see what the WTO has to say about it, and I think it's good that it's in a neutral channel to try to resolve the situation.
I heard that Ambassador Charlene Warshawski said that Article 15 of the China Accession Protocol is ambiguous, if I heard the word correctly. To me, that article is not that ambiguous. I think that article is pretty clear. That is, after yesterday, starting from today, the methodology identified in Article 15 can and shall not be used by any other WTO members. That is something very clear to a lawyer, a Chinese lawyer. Thank you.
And I could make the opposite argument, so which is why it's at the WTO.
Right. This is why we need dispute settlement.
Right. No, look, I agree the issue will be resolved by the WTO, but I do think it's unfortunate that it came to that, because here I have to agree with Dr. Young. I don't think the language is ambiguous at all. And I've read the interpretations put forward by those who say that it doesn't expire. Frankly, I don't think they would earn a passing score on a law school WTO exam. They're not well-founded arguments.
Spoken by an advocate.
Yeah, no, that's what I do, absolutely. But I think it's interesting. I mean, I guess the point is this, that it wasn't until the last few years that you began to see these creative interpretations of Section 15 of the protocol. Only as we approached expiration did these sort of new interpretations come to light. And I think it's interesting that the Committee to Support U.S. Trade Laws, which represents the interests of U.S. petitioners, explained in 2007 that after the expiration of Section 15A2, which was yesterday, China would, quote, automatically be considered as a market economy for anti-dumping purposes. This is the U.S. petitioner's part, right? And so I think these are all newfound interpretations. Frankly, I think it would have been the higher road simply to comply with this commitment that was a key part of China's protocol. But as everyone has said, it will now be resolved by the WTO.
Sure. Let me just add one little point on this. I have an opinion as well, and that sounds like the topic of the day, which is understandable, particularly given the news. I can totally appreciate that it appears that American views and views from others about this have shifted in the past few years. But I think it's also useful to note, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't even try to pretend to be one, that I pretend to be an economist sometimes. But from a political economy perspective, I think what's useful to know is that I think probably it's surprising to many that we're 15 years out from China's membership, and market access problems still seem to be as challenging or more challenging. And in the last few years, some of those seem to have become more problematic. And maybe that isn't directly germane to the legal question, but from the question of what would motivate the U.S. Industry and others to just move aside on this, I think that change in China's approach, and then also we've got a global financial crisis and global slow growth industries in the U.S. that feel challenged, and if you go to the anti-dumping regime in general, it's not a perfectly thought-out regime to begin with, because non-market economy status is kind of a problem that sits upon a bigger problem about it. So part of it isn't so it's in general meant to be a political solution. So I don't think we'll end up solving this without a political solution, even if there's a legal one, and in several years the WTO appellate body issues a verdict. There will still need to address the fundamental challenges that Chad mentioned about the adjustment, about how the rest of the world adapts, which we can't figure out just from reading the text. Okay, I'm going to come right here.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. As Mr. Guo said, one of the significance of China's accession to WTO is China will not use the unilateral way to have a trade war with the United States. But yesterday, President-elect Donald Trump have a Twitter saying that maybe the U.S. is not necessary to abide by the one China policy unless the U.S. could make a deal with China, including the trade. So I'm wondering if you would like to comment on this Twitter, and also are you concerned that Donald Trump will incline to use the unilateral way to have a trade war with China? Thank you.
Well, I think we had Rufus make the point that the wonderful thing about trade law is that we don't deal with the one China policy. And that's one of the wonderful things about as trade practitioners. So that's where I would start.
I mean, I think I'd say that, this is the time where, as somebody who's former diplomat, I'd rely on that old adage that a good diplomat is somebody who thinks twice before saying nothing.
Go ahead, John. Thank you very much. My concern and observation on this issue, President-elect, anybody on the possible trade war between the U.S. and China, my understanding is only that it's very simple. That is, rule of law or international rule of law is good, not only for China, but also for the United States. That is the lesson we learned from the history. So this is why I wanted to reiterate and also wanted to share with you international rule of law. Rule of law, multilateral trade system represented by China, by WTO. That is good and important to the economic development in the world and also the peace of the world. That's my understanding.
We have time for one more question. We're going to come here. I'm sorry, I'm glad that there's so many questions. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them.
Thank you. Eric Coolish, American Shipper Magazine. I guess I was curious if, under WTO rules, if China is still considered a developing country, and then, if that changes, do its import tariffs get ratcheted down? And then, I guess related to that, and it may have been answered, is what prospects do you see for the U.S. or other countries to designate China as a non-market economy, and then would China, how would they respond?
Can you ask the second part of that question again?
Yeah, just what are the prospects for China to be designated a market or, market economy now? And, how would China respond?
Yes. It's a developing country status.
My understanding is that when China acceded to the WTO, there was not a developing country status provided with regard to any of the provisions in the accession. Now, having said that, I think the Chinese may have self-asserted developing country status in operations within the WTO context, negotiating.
Well, even in the negotiations,
right.
Yes. I mean, just for example, in the market access negotiations and agriculture negotiations, China took the position. And this, look, in negotiations, it is a self-selection process. There are no hard and fast rules. We have different designations based, maybe, and if you looked at some of the UN designations based on per capita income, you'd reach one result. But if you look at other indicators, like success as an exporter or size of the economy or other things, you'd have arguments the other way. But certainly in the market access negotiations, they took the position that they would participate as a developing country. And that obviously is one of the issues going forward in the future whenever we have another major, for example, tariff negotiation or agriculture negotiation in the WTO system is, exactly what, I mean, one of the reasons I don't think it's practical to have these formulas that were used in the Uruguay round based on your status as developing, least developed, et cetera, is that whole paradigm broke down and didn't succeed. So what is the future model for having those negotiations with a country that clearly is world's largest exporter, and one of the two biggest economies in the world?
Hey, this has been a fascinating discussion. If we had more time, I know that we could go on nonstop for several hours. We might lose a couple from the crowd, but not I'm sure most would stick around. Rufus, Matthew, Claire, Guohua, Chad, thank you all for your insightful comments. Everyone, please join me in thanking the panel. All right, we're going to take a brief break, and then we will do some changes up here, and then we'll have our keynote speaker, Deputy Director General Yi Xiaojun, in just a minute. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to get started. Okay, if everyone can please take a seat, we'll continue with our program. Thank you. Well, we just enjoyed a really great panel, and I suspect that that conversation could have gone on all afternoon. And we're now approaching the final portion of our program, and there's no better person to take the stage now than our keynote speaker, Yi Jiajun. He brings a lot of different perspectives to this conversation, having worn so many different hats over the past 20 years or so. A bit about his esteemed career: he served as a key member of China's WTO accession negotiating team. He served as Assistant Minister of MOFCOM and then Vice Minister of MOFCOM when he was in charge of regional and multilateral trade negotiations. I understand he negotiated China's first free trade agreement with ASEAN, which was recently upgraded. And then he moved to Geneva to become China's ambassador to the WTO. And several years ago, he stayed in Geneva but became one of the deputy director generals of the WTO. Now, he did correct one thing this morning on Scott's presentation. I think Scott had mentioned there were about 1,000 members of the WTO Secretariat, and I think the number now is closer to 700. I've had the honor of working with Minister Yi through the years and in his many different capacities. He was well known at USTR. Now, that could be a good or bad thing, but in his case, it was a good thing. Through his work at the WTO, APEC, and other trade issues, he really gained the respect of his counterparts sitting across the table. And when Scott and I were putting together today's agenda, we immediately thought of inviting him. He speaks to us today in the capacity of his role in the WTO as Deputy Director General, and we so look forward to hearing his perspective on China's role in the WTO, his views on how he has seen things evolve through the years, and his thoughts on what we can expect going forward. So please join me in welcoming Minister Yi to the stage.
Thank you, Wendy, and a very good morning to you all. I'm truly grateful for this opportunity to not only to address this timely symposium, but also for a good chance to meet so many old friends, both Chinese and American. Especially Charlene, you are a kind of a symbol of China's accession to all the Chinese. When they think about China's accession, immediately your image jumps into their mind with your beautiful scarf. And actually, you guided China into WTO. And many friends here also engaged in that exercise. So I'm very happy to meet with you after so many years. And here I have a very little story to share with you. I never told anybody else. I owe a very big thanks to Charlene for the reason you may not even remember. Back in 1998, when US and China were stuck in a difficult negotiation on China's accession, my father passed away. And at that time, I was in Beijing. Charlene somehow heard this sad news, and you sent a flower to the Chinese embassy here and asked the embassy to send your condolence. When I heard about the news from our embassy, all of my family members, my friends, my colleagues were deeply touched. So thank you, Charlene. Now let me come back to the theme for today. 15 years on, a stronger WTO and stronger China. China's accession to WTO 15 years ago has proved to be one of the most significant economic events, both in our lifetime and in modern world history. Here I would offer some preliminary observations in my current capacity as somebody from this WTO Secretariat on China's accession and on accession process more generally through the lens of the WTO. First, WTO accession is an important catalyst for economic development in acceding countries. Up to now, 36 economies have joined the organization since its establishment in 1995, accounting for roughly 1/5 of global trade and the world GDP, and over 1/4 of the world population. Their accessions constituted a major liberalization of global trade in the last 2 decades. Tariff commitments of these acceding economies are on average 3 times lower than those of the original WTO members. In the areas of services, those new members have undertaken, on average, specific commitments in more than 100 services sectors or subsectors, compared with average of less than 50 subsectors for the original members. An analysis of the experience of countries acceding to the WTO shows that those accessions are associated with significant increase in growth and inflow investment for those countries that undertake substantial reforms. These countries grow about 2.5% faster for about 5 years after accession, and the economy is made permanently larger by about 20% as a result. So in this regard, China's economic rise is just one good story out of many successes due to WTO accession. Second, China undertook deep and broad commitments in its accession. Due to its efforts to join GATT and the WTO, China took big steps in liberalizing trade even before its accession. The average MFN tariffs in China were gradually reduced from 45% in 1992 to 15% in 2001, and further down to 9.8% today. Currently, China's trade-weighted average tariff is as low as 4.5%. In the area of trading services, China opened more than 100 services sectors and subsectors, such as finance, insurance, legal services, telecom, distribution, and courier. On top of this trade liberalizing efforts, China overhauled some 3,000 laws and regulations at the central government level, and many more at the local level, in order to bring China's legal system into compliance with WTO standards. And third, I would like to say China is learning fast in WTO dispute settlement. Empirical evidence shows that the more a nation trades, the more trade problems or disputes it might face. China has been intensively involved in the DSB in recent years. as one of the world's largest trading nations, buying and selling the full spectrum of goods and services with every country on earth. This level of dispute activity comes as no surprise for China. China's use of the WTO dispute settlement system started slowly at first, but gained steam rapidly. Up to now, China has been involved in 50 disputes, but Guohua told me it's 52, so I didn't know. I'm not aware of the latest two. But anyway, those disputes, including 13 cases as complainant and 37 cases as respondent. Additionally, China has participated as a third party in 135 disputes so far. I think the most importantly, China 100% complied with the rulings. Fourth, China's accession created a win-win outcome. China's historic accession has made both China and the WTO stronger and more vibrant. In bringing China under its umbrella, the WTO took a huge step towards achieving its goal of universal membership and inclusiveness. As a result of China's accession, one of the world's biggest economy is now playing by the same multilaterally agreed rulebook, just as other major trading countries. This is no small achievement, particularly in terms of strengthening global trade governance and the multilateral trading system. China's successful accession has also inspired many other developing countries to join the WTO. Since 2001, both China and the WTO have seen trade flows rise dramatically, with China experiencing a more than six-fold increase in the volume of its merchandise exports and a nearly five-fold increase in the volume of its imports. Meanwhile, the volume of world trade nearly doubled. China also became a leading exporter and importer of services. Since 2005, the value of China's commercial services exports jumped from $78 billion to $285 billion, while its share in exports doubled from 3% to 6%. Growth in services imports was even more dramatic, rising from $83 billion, or 3.3% of the world services trade, to $466 billion, or 10% of the total. For all the attention given to China's rise as an export powerhouse, commentators have focused less on the question of China's imports. From $243 billion in 2001, the imports from China leapt to $1.96 trillion last year. This is a significant contribution to the world economy, which is too often overlooked. In this regard, the IMF and World Bank reports indicated that China has been one of the leading contributors to world growth in the past few years. Absent the surge of imports into China over the last 6 or 7 years, it's very likely the global recession would have further deepened and that Asian countries would have been more adversely affected. Fifth, China's accession contributed to economic growth of its trading partners. In order to better understand the economic implication of China's accession, we need only look at the China's rank and share in the exports of major economies over time. For example, China went from being the 11th largest export destination of the United States in 2001, accounting for less than 2% of US exports, to being the country's third largest export partner, absorbing 8% of US exports. Among developing economies, South Africa can be a representative example. China was the country's #1 export destination now in 2015, up from 17th place in 2001. During this period, the share of China in South Africa's exports jumped from 1.7% to 8%. China is even more important for other emerging economies, including Brazil, where nearly 20% of its exports go to China. Furthermore, China is the only major developing country which committed to granting duty-free, quota-free treatment for up to 97% products made by LDCs. Ever since 2008, China has become the leading export destination for LDCs, absorbing about a quarter of their total exports. Finally, let me talk about the way forward for China. Being the biggest merchandise trader in the world, one of the largest recipients of FDI, and the top trading partner of over 120 countries and regions, China and any of its policy changes will inevitably have a huge impact on the rest of the world. Hence, in the latest WTO trade policy review on China in July this year, members called upon China to assume the increased responsibility and leadership that come with being a central player in the multilateral trading system. They also encouraged China to ensure fair and equitable participation of state-owned enterprises in market competition, to build better mechanisms for intellectual property protection, to work with all members to address the problem of overcapacity, and to vigorously promote investment facilitation. I believe our members will look forward to witnessing the fruits of these efforts. Here, I would like to emphasize the importance of cooperation between the US and China for a strong and healthy WTO. The US has supported the multilateral trading system since its inception in 1948. And China has also demonstrated a firm commitment to the WTO. It is crucial that the two largest trading countries work together to maintain and strengthen an open trading system based on the multilaterally agreed rules. In conclusion, while China's huge achievements during 15 years of its WTO membership are to be commended, the country must not rest on its successes. It is essential that China continue to play an active and constructive role in the WTO so that the multilateral trading system can continue to deliver new trade reforms in the future. And I have every confidence that China will do so. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. And the first question I wanted to ask you was kind of follows up on one of your last comments about looking ahead. And that is, some say for the WTO to have a viable and strong negotiating agenda, it's imperative that the US and China be on the same page and jointly work together to lead the other countries. This seemed to work in the ITA 2 negotiations, at least for the most part, but perhaps not as well in the recent environmental goods negotiations. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that and speculate on your views. Do you see a viable negotiating agenda for the WTO going ahead? And if so, how important is US-Chinese cooperation in making this happen? And how can US-China cooperation actually take place?
As I mentioned in my presentation, that the cooperation between US and China is crucial for any multilateral progress. If you look at the history or the successes or failures in WTO on the negotiating agenda, it's clear that whenever US and China got agreement, then we have a good chance to move forward. But if the two countries disagree, then there's a little chance that we can see any multilateral deal. So it's crucial, it's extremely important for US and China to continue to cooperate with each other for the future multilateral agenda. And meanwhile, I heard some comments about China's participation in the WTO negotiations. I think it's something like you look at the water is half full or half empty. For example, if you look at ITA expansion, China is the only major developing economy which agreed to join and agreed with the final deal. And it's the same thing with EGA, the Environmental Goods Agreement. Although it's unfortunate that those participants didn't reach agreement in the last minute, but they set a good basis for the future agreement. And I think if they can manage the negotiation a little bit better, I think there will be a good chance to reach agreement. And again, China is the only major developing country which agreed to join the negotiation. And the same thing is with the GPA. It's also another important WTO agreement.
The trade facilitation agreement.
No, I mean government procurement.
Oh, government procurement.
China is one of the few developing countries which decides to negotiate and try to join that important agreement. So personally, I think if you look at this kind of behavior, you may see that China has every intention to move in a positive mode on those important issues. The same thing happened in TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. China from very beginning strongly supported the negotiation. So in that case, we see the cooperation between China and the US played very important leading role in reaching the agreement. So in the future, I think when we look at our near-term trade agenda, we are preparing for the next ministerial meeting in Argentina, for the MC11. I think US and China may have some common interest in issues like e-commerce, like services, especially domestic regulations, and even maybe trade investment facilitation, which is maybe a new issue, but I see a kind of common interest in that area. So I think it's important for all the WTO members, especially the major players, including US and China, to find some common issue, to negotiate, to trade off, and to reach agreement. It's very important in the context of the current rising protectionism. A strong WTO is the best safeguard against those anti-trade, anti-globalization sentiment.
So is it fair to say then you're more of an optimist looking ahead with respect to the WTO's negotiating agenda than others, particularly some in the panel earlier? I think Ambassador Yerxa was a bit pessimistic.
Well, I respect my friend Rupert, who guided me to my current office. But I'm a little bit more optimistic. I agree with you that the WTO framework can do that much. It can ensure that the trade relationship between members should be consistent with their WTO obligations. But meanwhile, I also believe that other than negotiations and dispute settlement, we have some other tools like monitoring mechanism. I used to work in the Chinese government, so I know that, for example, the trade policy review matters a lot to the Chinese people, to the ministers in China, and to the Chinese leadership. So that kind of monitoring can encourage China to pursue their domestic reform. And for something out of WTO, like investment, I know that currently there's an important bilateral discussion or negotiation between US and China on so-called BIT. And meanwhile, we also heard that some members in WTO also discussing that investment is an important issue for WTO. It's a part of trade, or it's two sides of one coin, investment and China. There's a coherence. So if we can bring investment into WTO, that may strengthen the disciplines on investment. So that may be helpful partially to your concerns.
Okay. So investment in e-commerce are two of the issues that you've mentioned where there may be.
And services.
Services, okay. Yeah. So you did a great job in your presentation describing China's contributions and achievements as a member of the WTO. But I'm sure it wasn't totally easy for China in the process, not only during the negotiations, but also after the negotiations. So could you share with us a few challenges that China faced in the WTO process, both in the negotiating phase, but also in the implementation phase?
Well, I guess your questions have better directed to, to some representatives from China. I mean, I'm not in position to make that kind of comments. But if I can read the mind of Chinese people, the Chinese leadership, I can see that they are deeply concerned about the current wave of protectionism. China has a very heavy stake in trade and in multilateral trading system. So maintain a strong and vibrant multilateral trading system is in the best interest of China. So I think China should do everything they can to move the multilateral agenda. And meanwhile, personally, if I can provide my advice to China, then I would suggest that China should do more in opening its services sector. That will hugely reduce the tension between China and its trading partners. That will also help China to transform from manufacturing and from investment to services and consumption-oriented economy.
Thank you. Let me now open the floor up. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much, Deputy Director Yi. You mentioned the government procurement agreement, and as you know, that when China got into the WTO in 2001, it pledged it was going to negotiate to join the GPA. But here we are 15 years later, and the negotiations drag on. I know you're used to negotiating with foreign trade people, but I know that within China, so you're trying to come up with a proposal to submit to the other GPA members, right? So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into the sort of difficulties that you have in terms of negotiating with local officials and state-owned enterprises, because these are sort of the sticking points with China's current offers. So, you know, we know how U.S. states and mayors and others fight with the federal government here. Could you give us any insight into the dynamics of negotiation that occurs in your country in terms of, you know, what state sectors will be able to provide in terms of market access, what provincial governments, I mean, what kind of give and take does the folks in Beijing have with the local officials? I think everybody here would be very interested to understand how that would work.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Wayne Morrison with the Congressional Research Service.
Okay, so the question's on government procurement. And as a trade negotiator, sometimes we always felt that the toughest negotiations were at home and not with our foreign trading partner. And I think the question that this gentleman's getting at has to do more with the challenges within China with respect to joining the government procurement agreement. Is that something you can comment on?
Well, I'm very impressed by your knowledge about the details of this negotiations. It's not a negotiation covering wide coverage of membership, but it's a very important agreement. When I talk to Chinese leadership, I always encourage them to make further efforts, because it should be considered as part of their campaign against corruption. So I think it's a very good, agreement, and China, this kind of determination should be appreciated. And personally, I handled the GPA part of China's accession protocol. I know China didn't commit to join the GPA. China committed to starting negotiations. And just to share with you a little story behind that. We didn't negotiate with our partners on that. I remember some colleague, a colleague from the US team told me that it will do no harm to you if you just commit to starting the negotiations. And then he gave me a very interesting example. I'm not going to mention the country. He said, an important country promised to negotiate. And then later on, that country raised a very high requirement to trading partners. So after a few years, the negotiations failed. So he suggests that there's no harm for you to agree on that. That's what we did. But now I think the Chinese government is very serious about this negotiation. A lot of ministries, even the military agency, are involved in the negotiations. I think the next steps should be for those participants of the agreement to show their political wisdom, to encourage China to move forward and to finally reach the deal.
Other questions? Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Summer with the Shanghai Media Group. I have a question regarding the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, the FTAAP. China has been promoting it for a long time. And what do you think is going to help China better play its role in the WTO, and how it's going to help China better to build sustainable economic development?
Are you talking about
FTAAP, the free.
FTAAP, okay.
Yeah.
To my memory, it's an initiative raised by U.S. So China didn't. Okay, Wendy, you are the founder of that initiative.
So it's your question.
So China followed that proposal, and China supported the idea. I mean, recently. At the very beginning, China was very hesitant to move on that initiative because China was not that confident that China can meet that kind of liberalization. But now I think it's up to APEC members to decide whether they want to move on their regional integration on that basis or not. I mean, to me, to WTO, I think all the trade liberalizations should be welcomed and should be appreciated, no matter bilateral, regional, or multilateral. But we believe that those regional or bilateral agreements should be complementing the multilateral trading system. And finally, we hope the outcome of their negotiations, no matter whether it's liberalization or new rules, can be integrated into multilateral system. So I don't see a conflict between those regional initiatives and the WTO.
Good. Other questions? Scott. Can you be brief, please? Oh my goodness.
I was a professor, so not really. I wanted to ask about the issue of jobs and labor. The WTO's primary mission is about trade liberalization with the expectation that it helps economies grow, and you cited a lot of the statistics.
Which one?
The WTO helps promote trade liberalization, but it doesn't have a particular goal specifically with relation to jobs and employment. That's just considered a general benefit of economic growth. Yet, as we've seen in the United States and others, there is a gap between growth and job creation. For the most part, so is there a way that the WTO could shift from being a bystander to the question of jobs and employment to directly considering that as part of its mission to help countries grow in employment, not just grow in numbers, and address the challenges that come when trade flows end up shifting jobs from one country to another?
Well,
sorry, that was really long.
No. I think it's a very important issue. And I think the WTO and the economists, academia, they should be honest, and they should be more open to discuss this issue. Because trade, we all agree that trade creates a lot of benefits to the world economy and to WTO members. But meanwhile, we have to recognize that trade also may lead to some dislocation or job losses in some specific sectors, especially those sectors with high import content. So I think this issue should be better handled at the national level. I mean, WTO should continue its trade liberalization. Meanwhile, its members should be more inclusive to distribute the benefits of trade broadly across all the community. So, I mean, recently we have some studies that some countries are doing pretty well, like Denmark, Sweden, Singapore, but some other countries are not. I mean, even in China, I think it's a serious problem. So we would encourage our members that they should have a right diagnosis, because wrong diagnosis may lead to wrong medicine. The protectionism is a wrong medicine. It will not create any jobs. So I think WTO, World Bank, IMF, ILO, and other organizations should do more, and we have a close cooperation on the new research projects. But I sincerely hope that this wrong perception can be corrected soon.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. I still remember almost 20 years ago, Mr. Yi, I was a major negotiator with the US, and I was a reporter in Beijing to cover all these kinds of news. Very happy to see you again. And my question is, as a senior official of the WTO, do you believe in the next several years we could see more cases between the US and China in the WTO, or we could see more trade conflicts between the two countries bilaterally or even unilaterally? What's your suggestions for Mr. Trump? Thank you.
We in WTO are not in position to make any comment on any administration, but we have full confidence on the multilateral trading system, that the relationship or the trade relationship among or between our members can be well governed and regulated by these rules. And that's why I'm quite confident that we will not see a real trade war between our members. I mean, they all have their obligations to abide by the WTO, and dispute settlement can be a good mechanism to resolve their trade frictions and their tension. But I don't think they will go to trade war. I mean, trade war is again, it's a wrong therapy. I mean, it will not help you to resolve your problem. It will create damage to all. So it's a lose-lose situation.
Okay, well, with that, that was a very diplomatic response. That concludes today's program. I want to thank everyone for coming. I think it was a great session. I'm going to thank Ambassador Barshevsky, Minister Yi, and Ambassador Yerxa, and the other members of our panel. Maybe we can give a round of applause to Minister Yi and the other participants.